The Keys to WMS Vendor Selection Success. I'm Roberto Michel, Senior Editor for Modern Materials Handling magazine, and I'll be your moderator for this presentation, being brought to you by Softion, a global provider of supply chain software solutions, including warehouse management systems, or WMS. While WMS has been around for decades and is widely used to manage orders, inventory, and order fulfillment processes in warehouses and fulfillment centers, many companies are struggling with outdated solutions that hinder their ability to cost-effectively distribute goods and hit service levels. As a result, many companies are looking to move to newer solutions better suited to present challenges. But how do you go about developing the business case for a new WMS, setting proposal requirements, and working through the evaluation criteria for a new WMS? If WMS selection is on your plate right now or in the near future, this session is for you, as our presenters will help you understand the selection process, the steps involved, and will offer advice on documents and criteria you should be familiar with. What's more, our presenters are two industry executives with deep experience in WMS selection, and deployment initiatives. Our presenters are Dan Gilmore, Chief Marketing Officer for Softion, a noted thought leader in the supply chain execution and WMS market, and Tom Singer, Senior Project Manager with Tompkins Solutions, who has over 25 years experience in supply chain systems, strategies, and projects, including WMS. Dan will lead off our presentation, but before I turn it over to him, a couple of notes for our audience. We'll have time for a short Q&A, so submit any questions you may have at any time using the feature for that on the webcast screen. We'll get to those questions later, and if we don't get to your question, we'll move it over to our presenters, and they will be able to respond to you via email. With that, welcome Dan and Tom. Please take it away, Dan.
Thanks, Roberto. Really appreciate that and look forward to a great session here today. I've been around this business for a long time. Again, this is Dan Gilmore, Chief Marketing Officer at Softion. Some of you may know me from other roles I played over the last 30-something years or whatever it's been. But I just want to let you know who was talking at you here today. So Softion is a supply chain software company started in 1999 and with WMS, and built a variety of solutions around that in terms of things like labor management and yard management and assembly and kitting and products of that nature that can be combined in various ways. Also have what's called a warehouse execution system, which is kind of a newer thing we'll leave for another day, that optimizes fulfillment work in a way kind of beyond what a WMS typically does. Something called distributed order management, which is around sourcing, identifying the optimal sourcing location based on a variety of different attributes. So that's really the key three products we go to market with, and been doing that very successfully for almost 25 years. Just real quickly, I'm not going to read these off, just so you know the kind of customers we deal with. We deal with primarily large and mid-sized companies. And here you see just the usual logo type of slide that indicates, some of them you can do a quick perusal there. But we've got proof points in virtually every sector, very strong in 3PL, but a number of other vertical industries as well. And so just so you know who again is communicating with you and who sponsored this event. I'm going to let Tom Singer from Tompkins Solutions do the same thing, but I want to have known Tom for many of those years that he spoke about. He's been in the business, and so a couple of points. Tom's going to take the lead here on this, but I'm going to jump in with some color commentary as appropriate during the course of his presentation. And I just want to make the point that don't think vendors don't, know the difference between a selection process that's going well and a selection process that isn't so organized. And asked Tom to do this with me because I've been involved with projects with Tom, again, known him for a long time, and I know he does a great job of orchestrating the vendor selection processes. And I'm sure you'll get that sense as he goes through his stuff today. And again, I'm going to jump in where appropriate, but you'd be surprised what vendors know in terms of the difference of well-run selection projects and ones that are a little more disorganized, et cetera, as you can imagine. So look forward to this, hearing what Tom has to say here today and adding commentary where I can. So Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Dan. I appreciate the kind words, and especially the emphasis on a well-orchestrated WMS selection. Well, hopefully, as we get through this presentation, the attendees will have an idea of what a well executed, a well orchestrated WMS selection looks like. But let me start out first by introducing Tompkins Solutions to you. We are a global supply chain service firm that's dedicated to helping our clients achieve supply chain excellence and profitable growth. By combining best-in-breed services and technology, we deliver a true end-to-end supply chain solution that enables our clients to improve their customer experience and ensure long-term success. Tompkins Solutions offers supply chain consulting and material handling integration services. Our supply chain consulting services include assessments, network analysis and optimization, distribution center design, logistics outsourcing, implementation support, and supply chain technology systems. Our material integration services include equipment system design, turnkey implementation, and support. Supply chain technology systems, where I work, include assessments, selections, and implementation support. I've been with Tompkins for over 25 years, working in their supply chain system practice, doing assessments, selections, and implementations, primarily involving warehouse management systems. Tompkins was founded in 1975. This was the same year that J.C. Penney deployed what is thought to be the first true WMS. When I came to Tompkins, they already had an established WMS practice. The very first project I worked on was a WMS selection. Preparing for this session made me reflect on just how much the industry has changed and on our process for selecting a WMS solution over those 25 years. My first selection involved a formal request for information as a precursor to issuing an RFP. And that in part was because, vendor the capabilities and track records weren't well known at that point in time. The RFP had a lot of IT content surrounding servers, operating systems, and database. There was no the thought around the cloud or SaaS. Autonomous mobile robots, machine learning, AI, they were all unknown concepts at that point in time. While a lot has changed in what WMSs can do over those 25 years, I think the steps that we're going to go through here are pretty much the same ones that I used on the very first WMS selection I did, coming up on 26 years ago. Thoughts, Dan?
Yeah, just real quick, I'm going to both agree, not disagree, but it's kind of funny. I mean, the basic needs of warehouse operations, receiving, put away, inventory management, pick, pack, ship, replenishment, cycle counting, these kind of things, they're still there. But the difference is that, from years ago, most of them or many of those capabilities had to be achieved through significant customization. Now they're increasingly just available out of the box. And most of our jobs these days are out of the box implementations. That's one thing. But then, you reference the tremendous interest in automation, mobile robots, and put walls and things like that are opening up automation to the masses versus the heavily high expense, big footprint, sortation type systems we've known in the past. And that's really made a big change in terms of, needs analysis and demo requirements and all those things. And in some cases, it's not really clear how you demonstrate some of those capabilities. Show me how you're going to manage a put wall. Not so easy to demo as show me how you do receiving. So a lot has changed. And I think, over the next few years, the whole industry will, as the automation just continues. I saw 2 reports this week about the predictions for tremendous DC automation, and that's going to really impact vendor selection processes. And I think it'll, evolve over the next couple of years to figure out how to do that in this new environment.
Totally agreed, Dan. So let's move on and answer a very simple question. What is a WMS vendor selection? Well, it's a formal process where a company selects a new commercially available WMS package. Okay. Most WMS selections are based on a common set of elements. Well, first you need a reason. Why are you doing the selection? You need a plan and a team to execute that plan. You need a set of functional and technical requirements that describe what the WMS needs to do. You need a pool of vendors then you're going to evaluate against those requirements. You need some sort of bid document or request for proposal that the vendors will respond to. You need some sort of scoring or evaluation framework that you'll rate the vendors against. You need demos where the vendors are going to perform against scenarios you provide that focus on key discriminators. You need reference checks, and then you need a process to make a final decision. Okay. Now, WMS selections, even though they share those common elements, they come in all sizes and shape. There are a variety of factors that shape a WMS selection. First and most important is operational complexity and footprint. Are we talking a small single site the e-commerce distributor with a couple dozen employees? Or are we talking a large, complex, highly automated, multi-site, multi-channel distributor? The reasons and the key drivers behind doing a WMS selection will shape it. Are we doing it to simply improve our efficiency in an existing facility or support a new, highly automated facility? Are there any timeline restrictions that must be met within the selection process? Not necessarily by getting the selection done, but I need to implement the new WMS by a date certain. Date. Or am I looking for any other solutions, such as a distributed order management, labor management, or warehouse execution system, along with the WMS? What does my selection team look like? What is their knowledge base on the WMS industry and on WMS capabilities? Do I have any internal procurement practices that impact how I deal with the vendors? And then do I have any organizational preferences? Any of the key decision makers, stakeholders have prior experience with the vendor that's going to influence the process? Do I need to be cognizant of what other divisions within the company use as a WMS solution? Now, in addition to those factors, objectives shape a selection. Common ones, I want to identify the best fit solution to support my operation. But I also want to use the selection as a competitive mechanism to obtain favorable pricing and terms from a vendor. Also, certainly want to deploy a solution that supports future growth. Some secondary, but nevertheless important the objectives can be selections of good forum for fostering organizational alignment as you move into deploying a new system. It can provide an opportunity to enhance internal knowledge and insight, not only on WMS capabilities, but on your own needs. And if done correctly, it can provide a foundation for a successful implementation. Let's talk a little bit about the reasons. And first, the key drivers, and I break those out into two categories. The typical, I want to reduce operating costs. I want to improve customer service levels, increase throughput, increase space utilization, improve inventory accuracy. And then the situational, such as I need to replace a system that's at end of life. I need to address new business requirements or a new the business channel. I need to support a new building with new automation. I need to accommodate a new IT direction. I'm replacing my ERP, and as part of the process, the first step is to retire the legacy WMS. Behind those key drivers, you need a business case. The business case is going to serve as the foundation for the selection process. Now, business case development merits its own presentation. We don't have the time to dive into the details here, but you do need a sound business case that defines needs and requirements within a cost justifiable framework. You need to do that not only to justify procuring and deploying the new WMS, okay, but it will help establish the vendor landscape that you need to look at. Vendor solutions come in all price ranges for usage and implementation services. You know, it can range from a single dollar sign to $4 signs. So you need to have that business case defined so you know at what cost point, what bracket you're going to be looking at when you define your pool of vendors. So considerations here: completeness of a business case at the start of the selection. If it hasn't been defined, you're going to have to spend the time during the selection to define it up front. And then you need to identify and clearly articulate the drivers and a synopsis of the business case to the prospective vendors. This will help them sharpen their response, but it'll also ensure them that there is an actual sale here for them to pursue that justifies their investment in responding.
Hey, Tom, I'd like to just add a quick comment there. One of the things that we're seeing, it may not be part of the formal business case, or it may be, but certainly especially for folks with older systems, you know, kind of the underlying thread often is just we can't react to the speed of business with the technology we have, and whether that's adding things to drive productivity like automation or whatever, but just, you know, meeting the strategic requirements in terms of what customers are demanding, entering new channels, going to market in new ways, doing any of those kind of things. Just the lack of the distribution to keep up with where the business wants to go, which of course winds up being very frustrating for both sides, may or may not be quantified as the business case, but clearly it's an underlying thread that we're seeing more and more.
You're absolutely on target, Dan. Time to value, speed to value has become a critical the need when deploying new technology to support operations, and that's especially true in warehouse management. Operations has to contend more and more with the changing business environment, new channels, new customer needs, and they need solutions that provide a very, very quick time to value. Okay, so the next thing you need, WMS selection is a project. Okay, so you need some sort of plan, some sort of stepwise plan as shown here. Start, finalize requirements, pre-qualify vendors, and develop RFP and demo scripts, prepare your evaluation requirements, evaluate vendor RFP responses, conduct vendor demos, and finalize the recommendations. So you need that approach. You need to map it out against a timeline. Now, frequently get asked, how long does it take to do a WMS selection? And you have to bear in mind that the clients I typically deal with are, generally moderate to high levels of complexity. And so my typical answer is anywhere from 10 to 16 weeks, depending upon the shaping factors. You might be able to do it a little quicker. You might need a little bit more time. Okay. Now, you need a team to execute this plan, and that includes some sort of executive sponsor, a group of core team members who are going to do most of the lifting here, and then subject matter experts. You need a budget to fund that team. Okay, and since it's a project, you need a project manager with your typical PMO controls to manage the process. And you're going to be collecting a lot of material from vendors, so you need some sort of project repository to store this information. Considerations: you should always try to right size the plan and resources here to fit the job. Okay, so once getting a small site, single DC, e-tailer, I got a dozen employees. You may not, you definitely don't need the structure, the resources, and the timeline. And let's say, a large multi-channel distributor with a dozen sites need. Once you set a timeline and a schedule, be prepared for some pushback, both from internal resources and from your vendors. So show them as much flexibility as possible. Your internal team's all going to have day jobs. The vendors you're going to ask to participate are going to be pursuing other opportunities. And so you're going to get pushback there. Show whatever flexibility you can. And then finally, if you don't have the internal resources, either from a knowledge base or bandwidth side, look outside. Turn to an outside consultant to help facilitate the process. Okay. So the next element, requirements. And the step to develop requirements typically start out with internal review sessions, walkthroughs, and workshops, both functional and technical. Functional is start with receiving and work your way all the way through to outbound shipping. You take the results of these sessions and you compile them as a list of functional and technical requirements. You review, prioritize, and finalize those requirements. And by prioritizing, you come up with some sort of priority scheme that tells the vendor that this is a mission critical, this is a must have, this is a nice to have. With those requirements, you should also look to identify what I call the key differentiators. And these are what you're going to focus on during the product demonstrations. These are what will differentiate one solution from another. For example, most solutions, are mid and upper tier WMS, from mid and upper tier WMS providers, going to handle FIFO, okay, and expiry date. But the ability to go in, and this is especially relevant if you're a CPG distributor that distributes big box retailers as well as small accounts, the ability to support different shelf life windows for different customers, that can be a differentiator. When you go to the product demos, make sure you take the time to identify those differentiators and focus on them. Okay. So once you compile the requirements, you have final review, and you publish them in a format that the vendor can respond to. I like to use spreadsheets. There's no reason why you couldn't, compile them in a Word document or any other suitable document that not only allows the vendor to respond to, but can also help you rate their response. Okay. Considerations, depth of the requirements from the business case. If you come into the selection without a formed business case, you're going to spend more time in the requirements the process, developing the details, and then doing the cost justification. We already talked about focusing on the key differentiators during the demos. And I think the final one here to consider is that whatever you come up from a requirement standpoint, however you document it, it's going to be, there's a limit to what a vendor response is going to mean based on what you tell them here. This is words, and you can augment them by some process flow diagrams, but it's still, not going to be anywhere near a detailed design document. So understand there's limits to what you can do and what, the vendor can respond to in your requirements.
Yeah, Tom, I'll just make a quick comment in there, and maybe you're going to touch on this. I don't know, but and certainly for many companies, and understand it absolutely, but nevertheless, I'll say it. There's always the pull of the requirements being what we're doing today, in some fashion or another, and so, hopefully, some combination of a consultant like yourself or the vendors themselves are often, going to have better ideas about how to do things, and so we frequently, see requirements or winds up coming up in the demo or whatever that are really just paving over the same cow paths because that's what people feel comfortable with. I don't know if you have any thoughts on how to avoid that trap because we see it all the time.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. I was going to touch a little bit on this on the pre-qualifying because there's a natural challenge and tendency to look at today. It's a comfort factor. Okay. More, I think, a comfort factor than a failure of imagination. But you should be looking, and it's at requirements, and then throughout the process, you should be looking at beyond today. How can I take this tool and leverage it to, do my, to support my distribution operation better. New WMS is going to provide opportunities, just like new automation, to do things differently, to provide a much more effective operation than your legacy tool today. So certainly you need to look the beyond how you do it today, requirements through the end of the process. So once you have those requirements set, you need then to develop a pool of vendors. You do that by going through a pre-qualification process. The tools there are research. Web provides a lot of content on WMS vendors. You have industry analyst reports like Gartner's, WMS Magic Quadrant. And then your team members may and most likely will have past experience with WMS solutions. You have trade shows like ProMat and Modex where WMS vendors come and show their wares on the show floor. You can also leverage social media like LinkedIn to network with your peers. And finally, you can directly contact the vendor. Some considerations here. I always recommend trying to limit the number of vendors that you include in the RFP process to what a reasonable number is. And to me, a reasonable number is 4 or 5. If you go over that, you're going to spend extra effort that won't yield value. In fact, it may detract from the process, it may detract from focus. You should always, during the pre-qualification process, look at the vendor client base. Do they have customers that look like me? Okay. Should also consider their position in the marketplace. Are they a major player or a niche player? Are they a suite provider or the single point best of breed WMS solution provider? If they're a niche provider, a small vendor, I would also take a look at their financial stability. And that may be tough because they're undoubtedly going to be privately owned, and trying to pry out any profitability, let alone revenue numbers from them, is going to be a tough road. But you can look at such as how many the sales do they have year by year, what their the implementation staff, development staff looks like. Do they have any private equity behind them? Okay, so there are a number of challenges here out to pre-qualifying vendors. Certainly gauging fit to key requirements and determining budgetary fit is going to be difficult to do, but the tools will at least get you in the ballpark. We've already addressed if you don't have the internal WMS industry knowledge, leverage the outside consultant to help facilitate the process, and look to overcome not only any preconceptions and biases that you might find on the team, but getting into that, what Dan alluded to, looking, getting out of that mindset of, looking only at how you do things today. Okay. Since it's a project, you have specific tasks in managing the vendors that you'll need to attend to. That typically will fall on whoever is doing the project management function on the selection. Starts with getting all the vendors under a mutual non-disclosure agreement. You're going to have to manage schedule. You always recommend you consider doing an optional site visit and walkthrough. And this is not a site visit to a vendor customer. We'll talk about that downstream. This is having the vendor come in and looking at your operation, okay? Touring your the distribution or fulfillment center. You're going to have to address the questions that are going to rise from the vendors throughout the process. You'll need to provide feedback and notification to the vendors. And you may have to publish additional addendums and arrange for follow-up sessions that weren't in the original plan, but are needed based upon the responses that you received to date. Consideration, as I already mentioned, you're going to handle and get schedule changes. So how are you going to handle them? If a vendor comes and asks you for a delay on the proposal, the due date, or a different the demo date than you want to assign them, how are you going to accommodate that? Site visit, that can either be an on-site visit or virtual. I typically recommend doing an on-site, and once again making that optional because there's a resource and logistics element for the vendor. But seeing your operation firsthand is going to provide context. Okay. The only caveat I would put on that is if you're moving into a new distribution center with new processes and new automation, okay, you need to walk through those processes and automation with the vendor. You can do that either on site or you can do that remotely. And whatever you do here in managing vendors, try to provide a level playing field. If a vendor A asks a relevant the question, provide the answer and figure out a way to get it to vendor B, C, D, and E. And go out of your way to help the vendors submit their best response. Be proactive in pushing them for questions and having them, come either on site or receiving a virtual DC walkthrough.
That last thing's important, Tom, and I'm just going to real quickly here in the interest of time, but sometimes we see cases where the company that's looking for the WMS is, I don't want to say antagonistic, but that's not quite the right word, but doesn't seem like they're having the attitude that they want to get the best information from you as a vendor and really take into account what's going to make you the vendors be able to do the best job they can, because that's what you want. So don't there's a certain amount of arm's length you got to maintain, but don't make it so rigid that you're not helping the vendor, because it's going to help you make a better decision in the end.
Okay, so let's talk about a key component for a selection process, and that's an RFP document, request for proposal. Potential content, you need to give them the vendors instructions and schedule. Ask them for any supplemental information, such as marketing collateral, sample contracts. You need to state the key drivers for the selection. Ask them for the references, but be cognizant that they may not want you to contact those references up front. References are a valuable the commodity for the vendors. You should at least ask them to provide representative the references, and assure them that you're not going to contact them but through the vendor, and after you completed the shortlisting process. Should provide an operational overview, provide them the functional and technical requirements, list out the key discriminators that you're going to focus with during the demonstration. Provide any functional and technical questions that you may have, any questions concerning training services and collateral, implementation approach and professional services. And then you need to give them an operational profile and statistics that they can use to price. How many users are we talking about? What are we talking about, on outbound order profile, inbound order profile? Give them the basics that they can use to price their solution against. And give them not only in a point in time, but over a planning horizon, year by year, for let's say 5-7 years. Then you need to ask them to supply a high-level project plan. Okay. How long, given what they know from the RFP and the information they gather to date, is it going to take to deploy the system, and what are the high-level steps? You can give them a date they need to be completed by, or a date they can start by, but then they need to fill in the rest. Okay. And then you need a form for them to come back with cost. Usage cost, subscription cost, and implementation services. Considerations, that's a lot of information. So just try to balance the need for that information with the desire to be concise. Use the demos and follow-up conversation to drill into key details. Cut any vendor based upon their RFP, the response, if it doesn't meet your requirements, if the cost is off the board. And if you miss something during the RFP process, don't be afraid to issue a follow-up addendum. Okay, scoring and evaluation framework. This typically involves team member scoring forms that rate the proposal response, the demonstration, and references. Those responses are then weighted and rolled up into a summary report. Core team typically does a comparison of cost and deployment the timelines across the vendors. And they also do then a comparative analysis and assessment of their weaknesses and strengths. Roll this up and review it through the scoring and evaluation workshop, and come in with a final presentation. As you execute those tools, just keep in mind that no matter how fancy your scoring mechanism is, this is still more a qualitative process than a quantitative process. All right. And make sure you try to go under the covers and address each vendor's strengths, weaknesses, their ability to deliver a successful implementation on time, on schedule, without significant service disruption. And take the time to consider, is this a vendor that you want to establish a long-term partnership with? Okay. Demos. These are, demonstration scenarios and topics that the core team develops. Each vendor then presents against these scenarios, and undoubtedly there'll be follow-up questions that you will want to address after the session with the vendors. The content, typically you want to start out with the vendor giving a short overview and value proposition. Walk through their user interface, both for desktop and mobile, and then walk through the functional scenarios area by area, the technical topics, and then have them briefly explain their implementation support approach and their training services. Considerations, typically do the scripted the demo scenarios in a spreadsheet. Could do them in a Word document. You need to establish the duration by scenario. You need to give the vendor proper amount of time, enough time to prepare for the demonstration. Then are you going to do them remote or on site? The pandemic proved to me that I can do them remotely just as well as bringing everybody into a big conference room. Okay. And doing them remotely then allows me the option, do I do them all at once, demos in one day, or do I split them up by the topic and have the vendor start, all the vendors start with doing the, their presentation and user interface, complete that, and then move on to the functional. Make sure, as we talked about before, that your functional and technical the scenarios address the key discriminators that you've identified. Right? Ask them to explain their product roadmap and upgrade in the discussions, and then be prepared for some whiteboarding on functionality. Because Dan alluded to, you can't get all of this into one session, given the level of complexity that we see evolving in distribution operations. And make sure that you manage the timeline and effectively leverage a parking lot. And then consider shortlisting the vendors after the demo. Okay.
Tom, I'm going to just jump in there real quick. Tom, just a couple points in a kind of random order here. So sometimes we get scripted demos that clearly are just way more than can possibly achieved in the time that's allotted. So, maybe that has to do with experience. I'm not sure, but somebody like yourself, Tom, would certainly recognize that. So that's something you got to be a little bit careful of. And I'll just say that there's a big difference in the scripted demos between what I'll call kind of the basic approach, which is very limited in scope. So show us how you do PO receiving, just as an example there, versus scenarios that are more, I don't want to say complex, but have more depth to them. They ask you to show more than one thing, to show things working together. Now, as a vendor, there's a limited amount of those you can prepare for or whatever. But so the choice really is between more kind of basic line items in the scripted demo versus fewer true scenarios. I actually prefer the fewer true scenarios, but that may not be everyone's cup of tea. But just recognize there are some differences in the way that these demo scripts are handled.
Yeah, totally agreed, Dan. And there's a balance there, but there's outside of having them show the user interface, how easy it's to navigate, because your employees are going to spend a lot of time using the system. There's limited value going over basic PO receiving. I'm going to do it the same way. Okay. But as you drive into the more complex scenarios, you're going to run into the situation where it's unrealistic to have the vendor, actually display how it's going to work. It's just too complex to set up. You really haven't given them enough information. So you're going to have to strike that balance. And when they go to a whiteboard, you're going to have to evaluate how comfortable am I that they can deliver on what I need. All right. So reference checks, customer site visits. Let's cover reference checks first. And that's this, you schedule them, through the vendor, after you've gone through the shortlisting process. I typically like to do 1 to 2 60-minute calls per vendor. You have a small, team, typically the core team, 2 or 3 individuals on that call. You send out questions to the reference in advance, and then the team records and reports the results. All right. Considerations here. Everybody needs to do reference checks, but no vendor is going to, provide a reference that's going to badmouth them. All right. So, they'll provide only positive references. Make sure you capture on those references, though, background information such as operation size, how long they've been using a WMS, how long it took them to deploy. Use it as more of a learning opportunity than a critical evaluation mechanism. Okay. And follow up with a thank you note to each reference. See if you can connect to them, especially with the vendor that you select. This may be a friend you want to have for the future. Okay, site visit. That's customer site visit, where you're going to go out and actually tour a client of the customer. Those are extremely, extremely difficult to arrange. The logistics there, where, it's one thing to have a 60-minute call with a vendor, the prospect on a reference check. It's another thing to invite them in for a morning to walk around your facility. Typically I recommend only doing those site visits because you have to. The executives aren't going to sign off on the selection unless you have said, I've gone out and seen it, in the field, because they are very difficult to arrange. Okay. Final decision, then you need to wrap up any open questions. Then you complete the evaluation process by selecting a number 1, number 2. You refine any negotiating terms and condition the objectives based upon the vendor response. Then you go into negotiations, and typically you go into negotiations with number 1. Used to be go into negotiations with both, the number 1 and number 2, so you keep it competitive. But unless you're putting the same amount of effort, number 2 is going to know soon enough that they're number 2. All right. So, I'd say it's good enough to go in number 1 and just let them know that if you fail, there is a number 2. They don't come across with what you're looking for, that you got a number 2 you can turn to. Okay. And so you complete the negotiation, finalize the contract, get final approval, and execute the contract, and away you go into implementation. All right. So yes, you need to keep it as competitive for as long as possible, but look at it also too. Whoever you select, you're going to have a long-term relationship with. Use this process to cement it, not to aggravate it. Use it also as a process to get team alignment. There will be some people that may not be happy with the final decision. Work with them to see and get them aligned. You may need to revise your business case based upon the final terms and condition. And I always suggest publishing a final report that details the selection process, why you got where you're at. Some key factors to consider.
Tom, just one more quick comment on that. We talked at the very beginning about establishing the timeline and all that. Don't underestimate the time it takes to get the contract done in the overall timeline, because sometimes, for all kinds of different reasons, that can really stretch out. If you're trying to go live before peak or whatever it happens to be, don't think that contract's going to be done in 3 weeks or whatever. In some cases, it can stretch out a lot longer than that.
Absolutely, Dan. You're spot on. Okay. So key factors to consider through the process, step by step, is the vendor's ability to deliver successful implementation. Once again, on time, on schedule, without significant disruption. So we already talked about earlier, the time to value, the speed to value for any new future functionality you need to deploy. What the vendor's project lifecycle approach is, what their product roadmap looks like, what the user interface, the user experience looks like. Does it empower users to better do their job? How flexible, how easy is it to use? How intuitive? What extensibility, workflow, and orchestration capabilities the vendor provides? What their automation approach is, and that's not only for material handling automation and robotics, but also for process automation. What tools they provide for planning and managing labor resources, and how they fit in with your existing and future enterprise supply chain system landscape. Where companies go wrong in WMS selection? Well, first area is devoting insufficient resources. You mitigate that by having a solid plan, by staffing according to that plan, and by leveraging outside resources as needed. Lackluster vendor responses? Well, usually that's because you didn't do a good job of pre-qualifying vendors. You didn't provide them with solid requests for proposal and demo scripts. And probably more likely, you didn't work with them so that they could provide the best response possible. Quotes received exceeded expectation. Well, how solid was the business case that you had? How well did you pre-qualify the vendors? The deployment cost and schedule, the actual deployment cost and deployment schedule exceeded what was quoted. Well, it goes back the depth of your selection process, how good a job you did with that RFP document, with your demo scripts, and also the due diligence you did on the evaluation. And finally, this is the number one indicator of a failure on a WMS selection. You find yourself redoing a new WMS selection 3 to 5 years down the road. And to me, the mitigating factor is making the investment, time and resources to do it right. Okay. Final thoughts and observations. Well, make sure you got the proper resources and plan in place. Be as flexible and open as possible with the vendors. Always keep the long term in mind, not today, the future. Take the opportunity to learn and gain insight both on WMS capabilities and your own internal needs. Use the selection to build a foundation for a successful implementation, but recognize that an implementation can still subperform no matter how well the selection goes. Doing a selection right then is only the first step in doing a proper, successful deployment. Dan?
Yeah, I'll just some final thoughts here as well. We've already kind of talked about this directly and indirectly. We just see vendor companies taking too much time reviewing and scoring and what are basically commodity capabilities or capabilities that really don't impact operations that much, or certainly don't drive the business case or whatever. And so, you find those 5, 6, 8, 10, whatever the most important things are. Tom called them differentiators, or I forget the term exactly, but that get that agreed on up front and use that to focus on. Leave some time for the vendor to show some things. You've gone through all these requirements and everything, but that doesn't mean you've thought of everything. And we see some of these demo scripts are so tight, there's no time to show some additional capabilities or processes that may be of interest, maybe change your thinking a little bit, maybe open up some additional savings opportunities. Make sure you leave some time in the schedule for that to be accomplished. And we just see all over the map. Tom talked about scoring, but we see some scoring processes that are very rigorous and people taking it seriously. We see others where everyone's doing email and on their cell phone and that kind of stuff. And so just as a vendor, it's just interesting to see that breadth of way that this is handled. So decide how you're going to do scoring. You're going to be serious about it. And if you're going to be serious about it, you got to place it effectively. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Roberto for a Q&A. Here's how to get a hold of myself or Tom. Certainly encourage you to do that if you've got other questions or would like to talk to us, either of us, about a project. And Roberto, given the length that we've gone here, maybe let's just take a couple of questions here and call it a wrap.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for the presentation, Tom. That was a lot of good details. One question we have here is, who should lead a WMS selection, IT or operations? What's your thought on that, Tom?
Well, I got a very succinct answer, Roberto. It depends. Typically, it's operations. Okay, it's the sponsors, the senior VP of supply chain or operations. But if you're, let's say, a logistics service provider, IT's on the hook for spinning up a new client in the WMS, and typically in that case, they're the ones that are driving the WMS selection. If I have a major ERP vendor with a leading established warehouse management module, IT may take a bigger role. So it all depends. But if I had to say, 8 out of 10 are 9 out of 10 are operations led.
Yeah, and this is Dan. I'll add to that. I think that's right on. I'll say a couple of things. First off, the move to cloud deployment with all of the benefits that has in terms of spinning up the environment and later on managed service and all that, it makes the WMS project much less of an IT project, and I think to the good more of an operations project. And so that's part of the ongoing trend. And second, in the end, it's operations. The guy have to live with it and have to deliver the business case. And so, well, there's always dynamics in every opportunity or every WMS selection process. I really think in most cases that operations needs to own the process.
Great. I have another question, which I think is a good closer because it kind of throws things back to the vendor perspective and how they can improve. The question is, what are your recommendations to vendors on how they can improve RFP responses and demos?
The
first for you, I think.
Yeah, the first recommendation I have, is to, be, crystal clear in your communications. All right, when vendors typically subperform, it's because they at that point in time don't have the resources to properly respond. And most of the vendors that I deal with, they're going to take a very, very hard look at the opportunities. If the prospects let them know that it's a competitive selection, they know they have to perform. But still, they need to be forthright if they have a problem, meeting a schedule, that they have challenges, and can then the prospect help them out. Okay, if they have any questions, all right, they need to raise them, and they need to. I think beyond that, what they really need to do is to look at the material provided and try to understand that material through the eyes of the prospect that's publishing it. So the last closing thought I should have led with there is that when vendors subperform, it's because they come in and push their own preconceived notion. We know better than you how you should run your your operation. So for the vendors, take the time and effort to look under the hood of the customer's selection process. Dan, any thoughts
just
there?
one last thing. I mean, I think you're right on about that, but I think also when there's some kind of a winnowing process where you go from 5 to 3 or whatever it happens to be, often ask, what was the factor that vendor X got eliminated, and a lot of times the feedback is they just weren't well prepared, and preparation is a factor of a number of different things, including resource time and whatever. But if a vendor gets eliminated, oftentimes it's because they just didn't have either the time or the will to prepare adequately for the demo, especially, and it winds up hurting them in the end.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your thoughts and insights. Tom, there was great detail in this presentation. Dan, thank you for your questions and insights. That does close our session. Thank you for attending.
Thanks, Roberto.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you all.